The life of the Numenoreans. Of cities. Of old, the chief city and haven of Numenor was in the midst of its western coasts, and it was called Anduniae because it faced the sunset, with its town beside the shore and many other dwellings climbing up the steep slopes behind. Hard by Menotarma, upon a hill was Armenellos, fairest of cities, and there stood the tower and the citadel that was raised by Elros son of Arundel, whom the Valar appointed to be the first king of the Dunedain. Of belief and worship. Near to the center of the Middlemar stood the tall mountain called the Menotarma, pillar of the heavens, sacred to the worship of Eru Ilúvatar. A winding spiral road was made upon it, beginning at its foot upon the south, and ending below the lip of the summit upon the north. For the summit was somewhat flattened and depressed, and could contain the great multitude, but it remained untouched by hands throughout the history of Numenor. No building, no raised altar, not even a pile of undressed stones ever stood there, and no other likeness of a temple did the Numenoreans possess in all the days of their grace until the coming of Sauron. There no tool or weapon had ever been born, and there none might speak any word save the king only. Thrice only in each year the king spoke, offering prayer for the coming year at the Urukirme in the first days of spring, praise of Eru Ilúvatar at the Erulatale in midsummer, and thanksgiving to him at the Eruhantale at the end of autumn. At these times the king ascended the mountain on foot, followed by a great concourse of the people, clad in white and garlanded but silent. At other times the people were free to climb to the summit alone or in company, but it is said that the silence was so great that even a stranger ignorant of Numenor and all its history, if he were transported thither, would not have dared to speak aloud. No bird ever came there, save only eagles. If anyone approached the summit, at once 3 eagles would appear and alight upon 3 rocks near to the western edge, but at the times of the 3 prayers they did not descend. Remaining in the sky and hovering above the people, they were called the Witnesses of Manwe, and they were believed to be sent by him from Aman to keep watch upon the holy mountain and upon all the land. The Numenoreans thus began a great new good, and as monotheists, but with only one physical center of worship, the summit of the mountain Menotarma, pillar of heaven. Literally, for they did not conceive of the sky as a divine residence in the center of Numenor, but it had no building and no temple, as all such things had evil associations. Between the southwestern and southeastern ridges of the Tarmasundar, the roots of the pillar, the land went down into a shallow valley. That was named Norinon, the Valley of the Tombs, for at its head chambers were cut in the rock at the base of the mountain, in which were the tombs of the kings and queens of Numenor. Of language. The Numenorean language was a Dunaic, language of the west, or, to use its native name, a Dunayan. The Numenorean language was in the main derived from the speech of the people of the house of Hador, much enlarged by additions from the elven tongues at different periods. The people of Beor had in a few generations abandoned their own speech except in the retention of many personal names of native origin, and adopted the elven tongue of Beleriand, the Sindarin. This distinction was still observable in Numenor. Nearly all Numenoreans were bilingual, but where the main mass of settlers came from the people of Beor, as was the case especially in the northwest, Sindarin was the daily tongue of all classes, and Numenorian, or Adunayan, the second language. In most parts of the country, Adunayan was the native language of the people, though Sindarin was known in some degree by all except the stay-at-home and untraveled of the farming folk. In the royal house, however, and in most of the house of the noble were learned, Sindarin was usually the native tongue until after the days of Tar-Atanamir, the 13th king of Numenor. Sindarin, used for a long period by mortal men, naturally tended to become divergent and dialectal, but this process was largely checked, at any rate so far as the nobles and learned were concerned, by the constant contact that was maintained with the Eldar in Eressëa and later with those who remained in Lindon and Middle-earth. The Eldar came mostly to the west regions of the country. Quenya was not a spoken tongue. It was known only to the learned, and to the families of high descent to whom it was taught in their early youth. It was used in official documents intended for preservation, such as the laws and the scroll and the annals of the kings, and often in more recondite works of lore. It was also largely used in nomenclature. The official names of all places, regions, and geographical features in the land were of Quenya form, though they usually also had local names, generally of the same meaning, in either Sindarin or Dunayat. The personal names, and especially the official and public names of all members of the royal house and of the line of Elros in general, were given in Quenya form. The same was true of some other families, such as the house of the lords of Adunia, who lived in the important city port of the western region of Andustar. Of appearance and health, the people, tall and strong, were agile and extremely aware. That is, they were in control of their bodily actions and of any tool or material they handled, and seldom made absent-minded or blundering movements, and they were very difficult to take off their guard. Accidents were thus unlikely to occur to them. If any did, they had a power of recovery and self-healing, which, if inferior to that of the Eldar, was much greater than that of men in Middle-earth. Also, among the matters of lore that they specially studied was Horoangome, or the lore of the body and the arts of healing. Sicknesses or other bodily disorders were very rare in Numenor until the latter years. This was due both to the special grace of health and strength given to the race as a whole, but especially due to the blessing of the land itself, and also, in some measure, no doubt, to its situation far out in the Great Sea. Animals were also mostly free from disease, but the few cases of sickness provided a practical function so far as one was needed for the continued study of Horoangome, or physiology and medicine, in which the practicers of simple leechcraft among the Edain had received much instruction from the Eldar, and in which they were able still to learn from the Eressëans, so long as they would. In the first days of the coming of Numenorean ships to the shores of Middle-earth, beginning in year 600 of the Second Age, it was indeed their skill in healing, and their willingness to give instruction to all who would receive it, that made the Numenoreans most welcomed and esteemed. Death untimely, whether by sickness or mischance, seldom occurred in the early centuries. This the Numenoreans recognized as due to the grace of the Valar, which might be withheld in general or in particular cases, if it ceased to be merited. The land was blessed, and all things, including the sea, were friendly to them. Of aging and longevity. Long life and peace were the two things that the Edain asked for when the Valar offered them reward at the fall of Thangorodrim. The long life of the Numenoreans was an answer to the actual prayers of the Edain and Elros. Manwë warned them of its perils. They asked to have more or less the lifespan of old because they wanted to learn more. Of that reward of a longer lifespan granted to the Numenoreans, it is written, "The increase of the Numenorean lifespan was brought about by assimilating their life mode to that of the Eldar up to a limited point. They were, however, expressly warned that they had not become Eldar but remained mortal men, and had been granted only an extension of the period of their vigor of mind and body. Thus, as the Eldar, they grew at much the same rate as ordinary men. Gestation, infancy, childhood, and adolescence, up to puberty and full growth proceeded more or less as before. But when they had achieved full growth, they then aged or wore out very much slower. The first approach of world weariness, or seeking elsewhither, was indeed for them a sign that their period of vigor was nearing its end. When it came to an end, if they persisted in living, then decay would, as growth had done, soon proceed at more or less the same rate as for other men. Thus, if a Numenorian reached the end of vigor, he would then pass quickly in about 10 years from health and vigor of mind to decrepitude and senility. Numenorian mental development was also assimilated to some degree to the Eldarin mode. Their mental capacity was greater and developed quicker than that of ordinary men, and it was dominant. After about 7 years, they grew up mentally with rapidity, and at 20 years knew and understood far more than a normal human of that age. A consequence of this, reinforced by their expectation of long-lasting vigor which left them with little sense of urgency in the first half of their lives, was that they very often became engrossed in lore and crafts and various intellectual or artistic pursuits to a far greater degree than normal. This was particularly the case with men. Of marriage and child raising. Desire for marriage, the begetting, bearing, and rearing of children thus occupied a smaller place in the lives of Numenorians, even of the women, than among ordinary men. Marriage was regarded as natural for all, and once entered into was permanent. A Numenorian woman might marry when 20, marriage before full growth was not permitted. But most usually, she married at about 40 to 45 years, age 24 to 25. Marriage was considered unduly delayed in her case to postpone much beyond her 95th year, age about 35. Men seldom married before their year 45, age 25. Their time from the year 15 to 45 was usually engrossed in learning an apprenticeship to one or more crafts, and more as time went on in seafaring. Postponement of marriage to about the 95th year, age 35, was very common, and especially in the case of men of rank, high duty, or great talents, it was not seldom entered into as late as the 120th year, age 40. In the line of Elros, especially among the children of actual kings, which was somewhat more vulnerable than the average and also provided many duties and opportunities, both for men and women, marriage was often later than normal. For women, 95, age 35 was frequent, and for men might be as late as the 150th year, age 46 or even later. This had one advantage, that the heir to the scepter, even if the king's eldest child, would be able to succeed while still in full vigor, though he would probably have passed through the days of the children and be more free to devote himself to public concerns. Numenorians, like the Eldar, avoided the begetting of children if they foresaw any separation likely between husband and wife, between the conception of the child and at least its very early years. Numenorians were strictly monogamous by law and by their tradition, that is, by the tradition of the original Edain concerning conduct, afterwards reinforced by Eldarin example and teaching. No one, of whatever rank, could divorce a husband or wife, nor take another spouse in the lifetime of the first. A second marriage was permitted by traditional law if one of the partners died young, leaving the other in vigor and still with a need or desire for children, but the cases were naturally very rare. Marriage was not entered into by all. There was, it appears from occasional statements in a few surviving tales or annals, a slightly less number of women than men, at any rate in earlier centuries. But apart from this numerical limitation, there was always a small minority that refused marriage, either because they were engrossed in war or other pursuits, or because they had failed to obtain the spouse whom they desired and would seek for no other. Like the Eldar, the Numenorians tended to make the period of parenthood or as the Eldar called it, the days of the children, a single connected and limited period of their lives. This limitation was regarded as natural. The connection, the treating of the period of childbearing as an ordered and unbroken series, was considered proper and desirable if it could be achieved. That the married pair should dwell together with as few and short times of separation as possible between, say, the conception of the first child to at least the 7th birthday of the latest, was held to be the ideal arrangement. It was particularly desired by the women, who were naturally, as a rule, less engrossed in lore or crafts, and who had far less desire for moving about. Thus, the Numenoreans, who seldom had more than 4 children in each marriage, would frequently produce these within a period of about 50 to 75 years between the first conception and the last birth. The intervals between the children were long as a rule, in ordinary terms, often 10 years, sometimes 15 or even as much as 20 years, never less than about 5 years. But it has to be remembered in this regard that in proportion to their total lifespan, this period was only equivalent to one of about 10 to 15 years of normal human life. The intervals, if reckoned also according to their degree of approach toward the end of vigor and fertility, were thus equivalent to a rare minimum of 1 year, with a more frequent allowance of 2, 3, or sometimes 4 years. Vigor, that is primarily bodily health and activity, and the period of fertility and childbearing in women were of course not coextensive. The childbearing period of women was similar to that of ordinary women, though reckoned in Numenorian terms. That is, the range from puberty reached by Numenorian women not long before full growth to an age equivalent to a normal human 45, with occasional extension toward 50. In years, this means from about 18 to about 125 or a little more. But first children were seldom if ever conceived at the end of this time. Since in matters of growth, which included the conception and bearing of children, the Numenorian development differed little in speed from that of ordinary men. These intervals seem long, but as has been said, their mental interests were dominant, and also they gave great and concentrated attention to any matter that they took up. The matter of children, therefore, being of highest importance, was one that occupied most of the attention of the mother during bearing and infancy, and except in great households, cast a great deal of the daily labor upon the father. Both were glad for a while to return to other neglected pursuits, but also, it was said by the Numenorians themselves, they were in this matter more like the Eldar than other kinds of men. In the begetting and still more in the bearing of a child, far more of their vigor, both of body and mind, was expended, for the longevity of the later generations was, though a grace or gift, transmitted immediately by the parents. A rest both of body and will was, therefore, needed especially by the women. After the conception of a child, indeed, desire for union became dormant for a while in both men and women, though longer among the mothers. If the Numenorians were not lustful, they did not think the love of men and women less important, or of less delight than did other men. On the contrary, they were steadfast lovers, and any breaches in the bonds and affection between parents or between them and their children were thought great evils and sorrows. Of appetites and behaviors, there were in the early centuries few cases of the breach of the law or even of desire to break it. The Numenorians, or Dunedain, were still in our terms fallen men, but they were descendants of ancestors who were in general wholly repentant, detesting all the corruptions of the shadow, and they were specially graced. In general, they had little inclination to, and a conscious detestation of lust, greed, hate, and cruelty, and tyranny. Not all, of course, were so noble. Until the shadow came, there were in Numenor few gluttons or drunkards. No one ate or drank in excess, or indeed much at any one time. They esteemed good food, which was plentiful, and expended care and art in its cooking and serving. But the distinction between a feast and an ordinary meal consisted rather in this: in the adornments of the table, in the music, and in the merriment of many eating together, than in the food, though naturally at such feasts food and wines of more rare and choice sorts would sometimes appear. There were such things as wickedness among them, at first very rarely to be seen, for they were not selected by any type save that of belonging to the 3 houses of the Edain. Among them were no doubt a few of the wild men and renegades, old days, and possibly, though this cannot be asserted, actual conscious servants of the enemy. This suspicion would be proved justified by events in the years from c. 2221 c. below, of skills and crafts. The Edain brought with them much lore, and the knowledge of many crafts, and numerous craftsmen who had learned from the Eldar directly or through their fathers, besides preserving lore and traditions of their own. But they could bring with them few materials, save for the tools of their crafts, and for long all metals in Numenor were precious metals. They brought with them many treasures of gold and silver, and gems also. But they did not find these things in Numenor. They loved them for their beauty, and it was this love that first aroused in them cupidity in later days, when they fell under the shadow and became proud and unjust in their dealings with lesser folk of Middle-earth. Of the elves of Erisea in the days of their friendship, they had at times gifts of gold and silver and jewels, but such things were rare and prized in all the earlier centuries, until the power of the kings was spread to the coasts of the east. Some metals they found in Numenor, and as their cunning in mining and in smelting and smithing swiftly grew, things of iron and copper became common. Lead they also had. Iron and steel they needed most for the tools of the craftsman and for the axes of the woodsman. Among the rights of the Edain were weaponsmiths, and they had, with the teaching of the Noldor, acquired great skill in the forging of swords, of axe blades, and of spearheads and knives, and as is observed elsewhere, if they had had the mind, they could easily have surpassed the evil kings of Middle-earth in the making of war and the forging of weapons. But they were become men of peace. Swords the guild of weaponsmiths still made for the preservation of the craft, though most of their labor was spent on the fashioning of tools for the uses of peace. The king and most of the great chieftains possessed swords as heirlooms of their fathers, and at times they would still give a sword as a gift to their heirs. A new sword was made for the king's heir to be given to him on the day on which this title was conferred. But no man wore a sword in Numenor, not even in the days of the wars in Middle-earth, unless he was actually armed for battle. Thus for long there were practically no weapons of warlike intent made in Numenor. Many things made could of course be so used, axes and spears and bows. The bowyers were a great craft. They made bows of many kinds, long bows and smaller bows, especially those used for shooting from horseback, and they also devised crossbows, at first used mainly against predatory birds. Shooting with bows was one of the great sports and pastimes of men, and one in which young women also took part. The Numenorian men, being tall and powerful, could shoot with speed and accuracy upon foot from great long bows, whose shafts would carry the great distance, some 600 yards or more, and at lesser range were of great penetration. Sports and pastimes. Numenor was a land of peace. Within it was no war or strife until the last years. But the people were descended from ancestors of a hardy and warlike kind. The energy of the men was chiefly transferred to the practice of crafts, but they were also much occupied in games and physical sports. Boys and young men loved especially to live, when they could, freely in the open and to journey on foot in the wilder parts of the land. Many exercised themselves in climbing. There were no great mountains in Numenor. The sacred mountain of the Meneltarma was near the center of the land, but it was only about 3,000 feet high and was climbed by a spiral road from its southern base, near where was the Valley of the Tombs, in which the kings were buried, up to its summit. But there were rocky and mountainous regions in the promontories of the north and northwest and southwest, in which some heights were about 2,000 feet. The cliffs, however, were the chief places of climbing for the daring. The cliffs of Numenor were in places of great height, especially along the west-facing coast, the haunts of innumerable birds. In the sea, the strong men took their greatest delight in swimming or in diving, or in small craft for contests of speed in rowing and sailing. The hardiest of the people were engaged in fishing. Fish were abundant, and at all times one of the chief sources of food for Numenor. The cities or towns where many people congregated were all by the coast. From the fisher folk were mostly drawn the special class of mariners who steadily increased in importance and esteem. At first, the Numenorean craft, still largely dependent on Eldarin models, were engaged only in fishing or in coastwise journeys from port to port. But it was not long before the Numenoreans, by their own study and devices, improved their art of shipbuilding until they could venture far out into the great sea. The women took little part in these things, though they were generally nearer to men than is the case with most races in stature and strength, and were agile and fleet of foot in youth. Their great delight was in dancing, in which many men also took part, at feasts or in leisure time. Many women achieved great fame as dancers, and people would go on long journeys to see displays of their art. They did not, however, greatly love the sea. They would journey in need in the coastwise craft from port to port, but they did not like to be long aboard or to pass even one night in a ship. Even among the fisher folk, the women seldom took part in the sailings, but nearly all women could ride horses, treating them honorably and housing them more nobly than any other of their domestic animals. The stables of a great man were often as large and as fair to look upon as his own house. Both men and women rode horses for pleasure. Riding was also the chief means of quick travel from place to place, and in ceremony of state both men and women of rank, even queens, would ride on horseback amid their escorts or retinues. The inland roads of Numenor were for the most part horse roads, unpaved, and made and tended for the purpose of riding. Coaches and carriages for journeying were in the earlier centuries little used, for the heavier transport went largely by sea. The chief and most ancient road suitable for wheels ran from the greatest port, Romana, in the east, northwest to the royal city of Armenelos, about 40 miles, and thence to the valley of Tombs and the Meneltarma. But this road was early extended to Ondalsto, within the border of the Forestar or Norlands, and thence straight west to Andunie, in the Andustar or Westlands. It was, however, little used, for wheeled vehicles of travel being mainly made and used for the transport by wains of timber, in which the Westlands were rich, or of stone of the Norlands, which was most esteemed for building. Though the Numenoreans used horses for journeys, and for the delight of riding, they had little interest in racing them as a test of speed. In country sports, displays of agility, both of horse and rider, were to be seen, but more esteemed were exhibitions of understanding between master and beast. The Numenoreans trained their horses to hear and understand calls, by voice or whistling, from great distances, and also where there was great love between men or women and their favorite steeds, they could, or so it is said in ancient tales, summon them at need by their thought alone. So it was also with their dogs, for the Numenoreans kept dogs, especially in the country, partly by ancestral tradition, since they had few useful purposes any longer. The Numenoreans did not hunt for sport or food, and they had only in a few places upon the borders of wild lands any great need of watchdogs. In the sheep-rearing regions, such as that of Emeria, they had dogs specially trained to help the shepherds. In the earlier centuries, countrymen also had dogs trained to assist in warding off or tracking down predatory beasts and birds, which to the Numenoreans was only an occasional necessary labor and not an amusement. Dogs were seldom seen in the towns. In the farms they were never chained or tethered, but neither did they dwell in the houses of men, though they were often welcome to the central soma or hall, where the chief fire burned, especially the old faithful dogs of long service, or at times the puppies. It was men rather than women who had a liking to keep dogs as friends. Women loved more the wild or unknown birds and beasts, and they were especially fond of squirrels, of which there were great numbers in the wooded country. While obedient to the Valar ban on sailing to the west, people from the Blessed Realm often visited them, and so their knowledge and arts reached almost an elvish height. From Avalone, the haven of the Eldar upon Erisea, at times the firstborn still would come sailing to Numenor in oarless boats, as white birds flying from the sunset. For the friendship that was between the peoples, they brought to Numenor many gifts, birds of song, and fragrant flowers, and herbs of great virtue. And a seedling they brought of Celeborn, the white tree that grew in the midst of Erisea, and that was in its turn a seedling of Galathilion, the tree of Tuna, the image of Telperion that Yavanna gave to the Eldar in the Blessed Realm. And the tree grew and blossomed in the courts of the king in Armanelos, Nimloth it was named, and flowered in the evening, and the shadows of night it filled with its fragrance. Nimloth was the ancestor of what would become known as the White Tree of Gondor, and memorialized as a symbol of the line of kings and stewards of Gondor. The genealogy of the White Tree in its various manifestations is long, dating from the First Age through until the ending of the Third and the beginning of the Fourth Ages. It is recorded that for many years, following the founding of Numenor, the life lived by the Numenoreans was referred to as the Days of Bliss. Thus the years passed, and while Middle-earth went backward, and light and wisdom faded, the Dunedain dwelt under the protection of the Valar and in the friendship of the Eldar, and they increased in stature both of mind and body. For though this people used still their own speech, their kings and lords knew and spoke also the Elven tongue, which they had learned in the days of their alliance, and thus they held converse still within the Eldar, whether of Erisea or of the westlands of Middle-earth. And the lore masters among them learned also the High Eldarin tongue of the Blessed Realm, in which much story and song was preserved from the beginning of the world, and they made letters and scrolls and books, and wrote in them many things of wisdom and wonder in the high tide of the realm, of which is all now forgot. These accounts of the first years of life on Numenor end with a reminder that the life of the Numenoreans, for all its excellence, was doomed not to endure. These things are said for the most part of the days of the bliss of Numenor, which lasted well nigh 2,000 years, though the first hints of the later shadows appeared before that. Indeed, it was their very arming to take part in the defiance of the Eldar and men of the west of Middle-earth against the wielder of the shadow, at length revealed as Sauron the Great, that brought about the end of their peace and content. Victory was the herald of their downfall.